Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast, available every morning on Apple, Spotify or wherever you listen. It's Monday, the 5th of August in London. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Coming up today, the global stock market sell-off deepens over US economic fears as traders bet on aggressive action from the Federal Reserve.
Airlines suspend flights to Israel as the country and its allies brace for retaliation from Iran.
Plus, in the UK, Prime Minister Keir Starmer calls an emergency security meeting after a weekend of riots in Britain.
Let's start with a roundup of our top stories.
Global stocks are plunging on fears the US economic outlook is weakening rapidly and that the Fed has waited too long to cut interest rates. Japan's Topix hit a circuit breaker after falling 20% from its peak and is set for the worst three-day decline since 2011. Traders are moving money into bonds and other havens after US jobs data came in well below estimates. The head of Bloomberg's Asia Markets Live team, Garfield Reynolds, says bond prices imply a severe recession on the horizon.
The last two times that the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points at the start of a cutting cycle was in 2007 and in 2001, very beginning of 2001. Those were some very severe recessions that the US economy ran into. That's the bursting of the dot-com bubble and the start of what ended up being the global financial crisis.
However, Garfield Reynolds adds that bond traders have repeatedly misjudged where interest rates have been headed since the end of the pandemic.
Now, swaps traders are fully pricing in 4 interest rate cuts from the US Federal Reserve in 2024. JP Morgan and Citigroup have revamped their forecast to predict that policymakers will deliver a half-point cut in September. And the former Fed economist Claudia Sahm has told Bloomberg Radio that the data triggers her famous recession indicator, the Sahm rule.
Way too much momentum in the unemployment rate in recent months. 4.3%. So whether we are at that moment of a recession or not, this is your build into substantial weakening in the labour market.
Claudia Sahm there from Sahm Consulting, reacting to the US jobs weakness on Bloomberg surveillance. Economists at Goldman Sachs now put the chance of a US recession in the next year at 25%. That is up from 15%.
Israel is bracing for a retaliation after the assassination of major Hezbollah and Hamas officials. Airlines are suspending flights to the country and embassies are urging citizens to leave its neighbour Lebanon. It comes as Axios reports the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken told G7 counterparts an attack by Iran and Hezbollah could start in 24 hours. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a warning to would-be attackers.
Iran and its proxies seek to surround us with a stranglehold of terror on 7 fronts. Their visible aggression is insatiable, but Israel is not helpless. We are determined to stand against them on every front, in every arena, far and near. Anyone who murders our citizens, anyone who harms our country will be held accountable. He will pay a very heavy price.
Netanyahu himself is under pressure as the US continues to press for a ceasefire deal in Gaza.
Here in the UK, Keir Starmer has called an emergency security meeting following a spate of anti-immigrant riots across the country. Violence erupted in towns and cities, including Liverpool, Hull and Bristol, after the far right falsely claimed a Muslim migrant was responsible for last week's knife attack in Southport, which left 3 young girls dead. The Prime Minister has vowed to find those responsible for rioting.
To those who feel targeted because of the colour of your skin or your faith, I know how frightening this must be. I want you to know that this violent mob do not represent our country, and we will bring them to justice.
Keir Starmer speaking there. The weekend's unrest has been the first big test of the UK's month-old Labour government. Around 150 arrests have been made in what has been the country's worst rioting in over a decade.
Berkshire Hathaway has revealed it sold nearly half of its position in Apple during the second quarter. It comes as mega-cap peers, including Microsoft, Amazon and Alphabet, have all tumbled from record highs reached in early July. More now from Bloomberg's Doug Krisner.
The move could be interpreted as a lack of conviction in the Apple growth story. At the end of March, Berkshire's position was worth roughly $140 billion. Then, as of the end of June, it was worth $84 billion. Since 2016, when Berkshire first disclosed its stake, Apple shares have soared nearly 900%. Even with the sale, Apple does remain Berkshire's largest single position. If you're wondering about valuation, Apple's multiple is 33 times future profits. That's 11 points higher than the S&P 500. In New York, I'm Doug Krisner, Bloomberg Radio.
And finally, Kamala Harris has held meetings with at least 3 possible running mates as she gets closer to picking her candidate for vice president. She met with the Arizona Senator Mark Kelly, Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro and the Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, according to people familiar with her plans. Harris's meetings concluded on Sunday evening and the Democratic nominee is expected to announce her decision in the coming days. Those are our top stories. So it's been really quite an extraordinary morning in terms of the markets today, looking at the moves in stocks. Let's bring in one of our market live strategists this morning to discuss the sell-off in stocks. This was sparked by fears that the Federal Reserve is perhaps late to easing its policy and bringing down interest rates after US payrolls on Friday showed that there was much weaker job creation in the US than had been expected. Joining us this morning is Mary Nicola, who joins us now for more. Mary, just talk us through the scale of what is happening on equity markets. It's been a very sudden pivot.
Yeah, it's been a brutal morning this morning. The sell-off across Asia with the topics down about 10%, and then Kospi is down about 7%. So the broader market sell-off, as you mentioned, has been precipitated by that uptick in the unemployment rate. So fears of a recession rather than a soft landing are really overtaking the current narrative, and you're seeing it with the move towards haven assets, and that's sparking an increase in volatility and just an indiscriminate sell-off across equity markets. Not to mention also you have Japan's the external headwinds and then a hawkish BOJ forcing the unwind of carry trades. But that's also proving to be a bad combination for Japan's equity markets.
Yeah, Treasuries, the rally that started on Friday, continuing today as well. We're now looking at 2-year yields down another 9 basis points this morning, below 3.8%. How much expectation is there now in markets that a 50 basis points cut could come from the Fed?
Yeah, so if you look at market expectations, and granted it has swung around quite aggressively over the past year, the market is now pricing in nearly 125 basis points of cuts by the end of the year, and 50, as you mentioned, almost fully priced for the September meeting. It's important to point out this rapid change because early at the start of July, we were just at about 45 basis points of cuts for this entire year. And it's impressive how much the narrative has changed given what we've seen in the US data.
Yeah, absolutely, which is why it has raised, and a lot of our Bloomberg reporters have talked about, is this illiquidity? Is this an overshoot? Markets often do tend to do that. What are the other asset classes that you're watching telling us too? The yen, for example, Bitcoin, commodities.
Yeah, it's really about moving towards haven assets. So the yen has strengthened as a result. Same with the Swiss franc. Even the dollar, even though the hard landing concerns are coming from the U.S., the dollar is gaining a bit as a result of the concerns about this hard landing in the U.S., which could obviously permeate to broader global markets. So really, as well as the yen strength has been exceptionally important in terms of precipitating the unwind of carry trades. We see it with the Mexican peso and how much it's weakened, and it's going to continue in an environment of heightened volatility.
Mary, what should we be looking out for as we head towards the start of trading here in Europe? What should traders be bracing themselves for, or what is the next big event that markets could see this volatility shifting?
Yeah, the way we're seeing in terms of how futures are behaving, European stocks don't look very insulated. But really what's going to carry through, or what's going to really change the narrative, is the ISM services later today. That will be critical for every data point because that's going to be gleaned. And the data will need to prove whether or not this sell-off is in fact justified.
OK, Mary, very interesting. Yeah, we're going to keep across all the markets then today, aren't we? Mary Nicola joining us there from our Markets Live strategy team, our strategist, Mary Nicola.
Let's turn to the Middle East next, where Israel's bracing for a possible attack by Iran and its militias Hezbollah and the Houthis in Yemen in retaliation for the assassinations of Hezbollah and Hamas officials. US President Joe Biden is convening his national security team along with Vice President Kamala Harris to discuss this. Our EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson is with us in studio this morning for more. Ros, what do we know about what is Israel preparing for?
Well, that's the question. They're actually preparing for any kind of eventuality. We know that they're scrambling GPS, which is pretty standard when they just want to, when they're anticipating some kind of action. We know they're issuing cabinet members with satellite phones. We know that lots of countries are warning their citizens to avoid Lebanon, for example, which is another sign that the concern is this could be a multi-pronged retaliation from Iran. It might not just be Iran with some kind of direct strike on Israel, but also using its proxies, again, Hezbollah, Hamas and the Houthis for something that they can sort of say, look, we've done something quite drastic in response to the killing that happened last week in Tehran of the senior Hamas official, because they need to show something for it. And that's exactly what Israel is preparing for, the possibility it's going to be a multifaceted strike at some point from Iran, expected perhaps in the next 24 to 48 hours.
Talk to us about the US then. They've sent defensive reinforcements to Israel. Again, they have pressed for a ceasefire deal over Gaza. This is potentially one of the moments that the world was most dreading, wasn't it?
Well, that's right. And the US has been a long-running ally of Israel, including militarily. They send them a lot of equipment, including for the Iron Dome missile shield, which is very important for Israel, but also just using their presence in military bases around the region, using their warships in the area to try and, to create that atmosphere of calm and to lean on these proxy groups not to overextend themselves. So we've seen, for example, the US patrolling quite heavily in the Red Sea for months now, amid the Houthi attacks on shipping in the area. So very visible presence from the US. We know that's picking up. We know that the US sends Israel, as I said, military equipment. That's mostly for Israel to be able to defend itself. One of the things the US says is they don't want Israel using those weapons, for example, against people inside Gaza.
What does this mean for efforts, I suppose, from other G7 countries, and what sort of other diplomatic pressure could be exerted?
Well, it's interesting because the diplomatic pressure also needs to be on Iran and not just on Israel. We're seeing, of course, the phone conversation that was had again between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. We see the G7 convening and urging calm, including on Israel. But you can imagine there are back channels going on. We know the US has them. We know they're active, and they've been going on throughout the conflict inside Gaza involving Israel and Hamas. We can imagine that those conversations are quite active at the moment, again, to try and restrain Iran in its own response. But we're in this sort of era where you get one country doing something, another retaliating, the other country retaliating again. So you need Iran to do something that allows it to say, look, we've responded, we're done. But Israel then doesn't feel the need to respond again in turn aggressively. Otherwise, we're in a cycle that's just escalating. And that's the concern, that the tit for tat picks up to the point at some point things tip over, whether people want it or not, inadvertently, quite possibly, into that broader conflict.
OK, Ros, thank you so much for being with us. That is Bloomberg's EMEA News Director Rosalind Matheson then on a key story this morning, Israel bracing for a possible attack by Iran.
Here in the UK, the Prime Minister has called an emergency security meeting in a bid to calm anti-immigrant protests that took place in towns and cities around the UK over the weekend. Keir Starmer blaming the disorder on what he called far-right thuggery. Our reporter Tiwa Adebayo is with us for more now. Tiwa, could you just bring us up to date about what happened over the weekend?
Well, it's been England's worst rioting in over a decade. Just as a reminder, this all started following an attack in Southport last week that left 3 young girls dead. And there was an online misinformation campaign that had claimed a Muslim migrant was responsible. We now know that the perpetrator was, in fact, born in the UK. And so over the weekend, we've seen this violence continue and really escalate in towns and cities, including Rotherham, Blackpool and Bristol. And there has been a broader anti-immigrant anti-immigrant sentiment to this violence. So, for example, in Rotherham, there were rioters on Sunday who attacked a hotel that they believed was housing asylum seekers. They started a fire and injured around a dozen police officers. A similar thing also happened in Hull, where demonstrators actually gathered outside a hotel. Again, they thought asylum seekers were there. A number of windows were smashed and bottles thrown. And actually, in videos uploaded to social media, many of the rioters can be heard chanting, "Stop the boats." Obviously, a slogan that has been used by politicians in this country with regards to controlling the migrant crisis and asylum seekers. So far, around 150 arrests have been made. So it's been a difficult and frightening time for many in those communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And there will be a meeting of the Prime Minister today being organised in terms of the response. We've heard from Keir Starmer. We've also heard from the Home Secretary.
Yeah, the government does seem to be operating a sort of two-pronged response to this at the moment. They're both emphasising that the people responsible will be punished eventually, but they're also focusing on the matter at hand, which is safeguarding those vulnerable in the communities. And it's been really a first big test for this government, which, remember, is only a month old. Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, a former Director of Public Prosecutions, he's very focused on bringing those responsible to justice. He's promised that those engaged in what he's describing as far-right thuggery will face the full force of the law. But he's also called an emergency security meeting in a bid to really quell the unrest that's happening at the moment. There are worries that further rallies are planned. In terms of the security for targeted communities, we've also, as you mentioned, heard from the Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, and she's announced that additional measures will be put in place to protect mosques, and she's pledged the full backing of the police in dealing with this unrest. The government have really been consistent in this message of sort of retribution and deterrence, though Yvette Cooper has also said on X that anyone that gets involved in criminal disorder will have to pay the price. So security forces too are echoing this message. We've heard from high up officials in the police that they will do whatever it takes to make sure that those responsible will get through the court system. So it's really a message of deterrence and of retribution that we're hearing so far.
Tiwa, one of the things that's being considered in this response is holding emergency court sittings through the night. That's something last seen in 2011 during the riots that you mentioned earlier, which was, these incidences of violence being compared to those as the worst since that date. How closely can we compare these two incidents?
So at this stage, we can't say that these riots have been as severe as what took place in London in 2011. In our Bloomberg reporting, we've quoted Cassia Rowland, who is a senior researcher at the Institute for Government, and she says this situation is not yet a crisis. And if we really look at the numbers, back in London in 2011, there were 5,175 offences recorded by the police and almost 4,000 people arrested by the time we reached early September. Comparing that to these riots, so far we've seen just about 150 arrests, so not quite on the same scale. But interestingly, the role of social media in perpetuating disinformation seems to be slightly similar. So back in 2011, Scotland Yard's Deputy Assistant Commissioner said that social media and other methods were used in the organisation of the 2011 riots. And also in regards to the riots that took place in London, there was some social media conversation and postings about further incidents happening across the country, with people posting on Twitter saying that things would happen in other cities. And this sort of disinformation was criticised at the time, and we're seeing a similar thing happening with these riots taking place now, a number of posts fueling further violence. So we'll see what happens with these posts on social media and how they're eventually dealt with by the relevant authorities too.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.